Parsha Shoftim, Sicha Beis. Pasuk tells us about having a king, Sentosim Alech Melech, the mitzvah of having a king, and gives a number of things that a king is not allowed to do. And one of them is Pasuk Tezayin, the second portion of the Chumash, says, Rak lo yarba lo susim. He shouldn't have an abundance of horses. Now, what that means, he's allowed to have exactly what he needs for his chariots, but he's not allowed to add anything. Only kedei merkaftoi, Rashi says. And the reason is, v'lo yoshev es ha'am mitzrayim. He shouldn't return the nation to Egypt, l'man harbois sus, in order to get horses. So Rashi explains, Shelo Yoshev es ha'am mitzrayim, he shouldn't return the nation to Mitzrayim, sha'susim boim misham. The horses come from there. As it says, by Shlomo, he brought him a cover from there. And then it adds, Hashem Omar Lochem, the Eibishter has told you. Now the question is, does it mean has told you or is telling you? We'll discuss that momentarily. You are not to return this way again, meaning go back to Mitzrayim. The Rebbe in Sicha Beis, Parsha Shoftim, starts off the discussion about this pasuk, and he says that we learn now that you're not going to go back to Mitzrayim. And the Rambam brings us halacha. And he writes that the three different psukim that speak about this. Now, in addition to that, it's an eye-opening statement from the Rambam, because the Rambam himself lived in Mitzrayim. And there is a big discussion of how was it that the Rambam was able to live in Mitzrayim. Now, there are a lot of answers. However, none of the answers answer the Rambam, because the Rambam brings it as a halacha. I mean, none of the answers, but many of the answers don't solve the problem with the Rambam. Now, there is another halacha regarding Mitzrayim, which is that a Mitzri, an Egyptian, is not allowed to marry a Jewish woman until the third generation. Right? So the Rambam there, when he discusses that halacha in Hilchos Isurei Bia, there the Rambam says, wait, not such a big problem, because we all know that when Sancherib, the king of Syria, Ashur, mixed the world up, he settled people in different places so that nobody should be a home, nobody should feel ownership of where they are. And therefore, the Egyptians are not the Egyptians anymore. So everything became permissible. And then it ends up with the following words, Shekal ha'perish mehem lihiz gayer. Whoever leaves the fold of the Egyptians to become a convert is definitely from the majority. Just to take a second and explain what he is alluding to and what he's referring to. Basically, what he's saying is that, and this is explained later in the Sikha with the Lavush, that Sancherib didn't totally uproot the Egyptians. There were some Egyptians that stayed. That wasn't his goal. His goal was to uproot the nationality, but the individual he didn't care about. Now the rule is kol kavua kemachza machza. When something is in its place, we don't say we go according to the majority. This is its place, then we have to look at it as an equal doubt. It's an equally doubtful item, and therefore in this case, if you go into Egypt, now if an Egyptian leaves Egypt and goes to China, and you want to know if he's Egyptian or not, you can rely on Ray. You can rely on Ray. But in Egypt, we're the home of the Egyptians, they're called Kavua, there doesn't work. Even if the majority are not Egyptians, this is the home of the Egyptians, it's Kavua, it's Kemachza Machza. So what the Rambam is saying something here with this line. And as Dev explains it in the Sikha, beautiful explanation. So basically what he's saying is that it's permissible to marry an Egyptian who converts because we assume he is not an Egyptian. Theoretically, it's only theoretically because everybody rejects that immediately. We can use the same logic as to why it is permissible to live in Egypt. Because they're not Egyptians anymore. However, that doesn't work. Because that doesn't work. Because A, you're in Egypt. And also, there goes into a discussion that it's not the people of Egypt. As we're going to see later, some of the answers are that it's those people. There is a land that lends itself to the type of people that the Abish does not want us to associate with. That's the type of land it is. It's a country that produces certain type of people. There's a medrash that there are certain lands and waters that produce certain type of midas, certain type of character traits. It's an interesting concept. It does exist in different the writings. Maral of Prague, in one of his writings, he goes on to explain that every country is rooted in their land that belongs to them. That land produces the type of people of that country. And he brings out how Eretz Yisrael is really our land, not just because it's our land, because we have ownership of a land. It's because our being is connected to that type of a land. And he says that every land is like that. Every land has its type of people that it produces. In other words, obviously a person has free choice, but there's a certain characteristic that a land produces. I'm not talking about the Sabra type of person. I'm talking about the person that is capable of receiving a Torah, is capable of being a godly person. That's what the Maral is talking about, at least. So that's what the Rebbe refers to here. Perhaps it's not. That's not. It's the land, and the land creates these type of people. So it has nothing to do with who is there. And it's an interesting halacha. The Rambam clearly states that when would Egypt be permissible to live in? If a Jewish king, this is the Rambam's own idea, which doesn't bring a source for it, but he just bases it on this understanding of what that would do. If a Jewish king were to capture it with the legalities of capturing it and turn it into a province of Israel, then it's okay. Then it becomes no more land of Egypt. I guess that would make it into a different type of land. Perhaps, I just want to add this line. We know, I see the that Israel is going to eventually rebuild the natural habitat of every human being. That will change the people. It's a different land. The world will be different. It's not just that we will control people. It's not the idea. An ancestral living, different type of life. That's what he means. That when he takes it, he turns it into a different land. However, the Rebbe doesn't like that in the words of the Rambam, who seems to put an emphasis on the people that are there and with their terrible midas, and that's why it's forbidden. Anyway, so the bottom line is, what he wants to try to bring out is he wants to separate the Isser of living there, which he doesn't really get into why, and it's an interesting thing. And he starts off the sikha about that, but he really doesn't get into answering the questions and relies on the answers that are given, other answers. The main point of this sikha is really the second half. How do we apply this concept? Why is it considered forbidden to marry? I'm sorry, why is it permitted to marry somebody coming out of Mitzrayim? If it's still forbidden to live there, why is it permitted to marry them? And here the Rebbe comes up with, based on a lavush and also based on the words of the Rambam, he comes up with a phenomenal idea that when we say kol the parish, miruba parish, which means when something is not in its habitat and it's in its place, and therefore it's considered, now we have to judge, where does it come from? Is it from the majority or the minority? So the Rebbe then, the Rebbe says that you can be, even if you're in your habitat, but if you change your being by becoming a convert, you have left your habitat. That's a new place. You're in a new being, a new place. And he alludes to the famous statement in Halacha that a convert is a newborn person. So doesn't carry the Mitzri habitat with him, and therefore is not considered kavua, that's his place. He is now considered porish. He's been removed, and therefore he goes according to the halacha of kol the porish, miruba porish. That is the gist of the brilliance of this sikha, which is incredible. Incredible piece. It's really a deep understanding of the idea of parish and kavua, which needs to be dealt with and discussed at length in many ways. So I want to take a few moments and deal with the actual problem. How do we resolve the fact that the Rambam lived there? Jewish communities is another problem. But I'm more interested in trying to understand the Rambam's living there. Perhaps the other communities we can find easier solutions because they don't have to hold like the Rambam, but the Rambam does have to hold like the Rambam. In other words, not everybody agrees to the Rambam's opinion that Isser is relevant today. So if a community settled there, they could have held that Isser was only in a certain time under certain circumstances, and it's therefore not relevant today. And that would solve a lot of issues. The problem is that the Rambam can't hold different than what he wrote. And he writes it's relevant today. Some of the answers we're going to discuss that are said are don't fit with the Rambam Shitta. Okay, so let's just begin with one of the most. Uh, so we're going to focus now not on the communities so much, which is also asked, but again, as I said, the communities did not have to follow the Rambam's opinion, and there are other opinions. But I want to deal with the Rambam's opinion and the Rambam himself. So, just to begin with, there is a letter that is quoted from a grandson of the Rambam that the Rambam used to sign on his own. He used to sign his letters sometimes. I don't know if he did it always, or he did it sometimes, or he did it many times. I'm not sure, but he signed the following words: "Ha'over b'shalish lavin b'chol yaim." He wrote his name, and then he added the words who transgresses 3 lavin every day. So is it possible to think that the Rambam was over 3 lavin every day? It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. I have another problem is, I mean, okay, it's not such a big question, but the Rambam Paskin is in Hilchas Shuva that you're not supposed to confess in public. Confession between unless you're doing something to a specific person, then you confess in public, but privately you don't confess in public. When it's between you and God, you don't confess in public. Why would the Rambam put this on his letters? It's not such a big question because the Rambam was a public man, so it was relevant to people to know. As we'll say, in the end, that's definitely the reason he did it. But the bigger question is to believe that the Rambam was over. Chas v'shalom, 3 lavin a day. I mean, come on. The man who's probably the greatest scholar and the greatest scholars in Jewish history, and then that would be the case. Can be. The Sefer Kafta B'Ferach, which is written by a Rishon, writes that I would like to suggest, he says, as a partial consolation to this, that the Rambam had no choice. He was forced by the Sultan, by the kings, whoever they were, of Egypt, because he was a doctor. And that's why he did. As we find certain heterim that were given, certain leniencies that were given to people who were close to the king, that they were allowed to dress in ways that were inappropriate for a Jew according to halacha, and that's basically part of their position for the sake of everybody else. So he wants to say he was basically forced. He was an einus, which would, I mean, it's definitely a possible answer, and it's given by a very great person. I'm not just hard to believe that the Rambam was writing on himself he's over when he wasn't. He should have said that I would be over if I would be under certain circumstances. Okay. Another answer that the Kafta B'Ferach gives, and that's a very common answer. And the lashon of the pasuk is that we read it, that the pasuk says, and God said, don't go back in this form. Don't go back this way. So they want to say that the Isser is not to live in Egypt. The Isser is to go from the way the Eden left Egypt, reverse the path, and go back. That's what's awesome. It's a reading of the pasuk, and listen, if that's what it says. That's what it says. We'll accept it. The Pri Chadash in Hilchas Melachim, he goes on based on which the Rebbe rejects as pshat, but he goes on to say that the way the Rambam says there that you're allowed to marry Egyptians because the Egyptians don't live there anymore, therefore you can go back. Now, it's great, but the Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam writes it's us to live there. How can you say that on the Rambam? I don't. He said it. Because these are big people. I don't understand how they say it, but they say it. Now, again, if you want to justify the communities, I have no problem. That's a good justification. There are those who believe that. And that's what Rabbi Bechai really in Pasha Shoftim says, that it was only a mitzvah temporarily for during that time, because the Mitzrayim were known for their evil and the way they live. They I guess, theoretically, let's just assume, compare it to Nazi Germany, that type of rishus, that type of evil, we don't have a law on that. People have imposed their own stringencies and not buying certain products that come from there. But that's not the Minatera. That was only temporary while those people were living. And that justifies all the communities that live there. Okay, that's good. Very good. Communities I have no problem with, but doesn't answer the problem. The Radvaz doesn't say that the process of going this way or that way, it's a specific path. If you were in Eretz Yisrael, you can't go to Egypt. But that doesn't mean the path. It means don't go from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. If you weren't in Eretz Yisrael, Egypt's okay. Then the Radvaz comes up with another part. Now, I wanted to say that the Rambam's use of the word lishtakeya over here I didn't go in reading the Rambam because it's not a Shiur on Rambam, it's a Shiur on the Sikha. But I did give the similar Shiur on the Rambam, and I was with a lot of diukim in that Rambam. The Rambam is really, really unique in the way he writes. But the Radvaz wants to say that the Torah forbade us to live there. But if you go in there for business and you end up staying, it's okay. And because people couldn't afford to live, and this was a place where they were able to live, and therefore it's not awesome. All right. But he says the Rambam doesn't seem to hold that it's mutter. Interesting, the Korban Eda says that since we have to believe in Mashiach, and every Jew is waiting for Mashiach, therefore nobody is ever really living in Egypt permanently. He's always on his way out. Good. It's a beautiful idea. The question is that legally absolve you from the Isser? The Chidah, based on a Ritva, wants to say that the Isser is only when Jews are settled in Eretz Yisrael. But once we're in exile, who cares where we live? The idea was don't leave the Yishuv of Yidden in Eretz Yisrael. When Jews are settled in Eretz Yisrael, the kibbutz as a Jewish nation, then it is to live in Mitzrayim. But Stamazay, what would be today when there is a Jewish kibbutz in Eretz Yisrael? Could be we'd hold it as us. It's a different story. That's why we make peace with them. The Sheila Meshiv, Chuvis, Sheila Meshiv, he says, in the same kind of concept, he says that the Isser is only that the Jews as a whole shouldn't go back to Mitzrayim. But individually, it's not a problem. You shouldn't put the nation back in Mitzrayim, which flies in the face of the simple pshat in the pasuk, which we're going to explain shortly. And the Rambam doesn't say that. Okay, again, all this is beautiful if you want to explain the communities. None of these answers are good, but not the Rambam. The Rambam has to fit with what he believes. Okay, I want to analyze one part that we didn't get into. As we started off the pasuk. The pasuk is an interesting pasuk. It doesn't tell you just straight out, don't settle in Egypt. Don't shouldn't have too many horses because then he's going to end up going back to it. So the Ramban asks, but you let it go for business. What's the problem? It says clearly, the Yerushalmi says, so what's wrong with going and buying horses there? So the Ramban says an interesting shot, that don't buy horses at all. And the main thing he wants is doesn't want him to rely on horses. Don't rely on horses. Then he said, don't send some of your slaves and some of your servants, your horse connoisseurs, to go and live there to rely on their horses. So it's clear that Ramban understands the pasuk to tell you it's not the nation that's going back. We don't need a whole nation to go back and get horses. You need people who understand horses. They'll send me there. I'll come back with a couple of cows that look like horses. You need somebody who knows the difference between a white horse, a black horse, a horse that's good, the horse that doesn't, the horse that can ride, that can run, there's all kinds of horses. The Mizrahi says that since he's going to have to send people to live there, that's what he's going to send them for. Because they're going to have to set up shop there, looking out for best horses that can find. It's not they're going l'schaira. They're going to live there in order to do schaira. When you go to schaira, the Mizrahi says the heter to go to schaira means you're going. That's what the Ramban says. It's going temporarily. They're not going temporarily. You need eyes on the ground there to get the best horses as they come. They gotta go. There's gonna be other people grabbing them away from you. And that's what the issue is. Okay. Now, I came across the Maral in the Gur Ari, which is his Pirush on Chumash. And perhaps it gives us an insight into what is the Torah's idea of horses and what is this all about. And it's just such a beautiful piece of morale that I want to read it together with you, translate some of it. He says that the most choice horses are in Mitzrayim. And therefore, he's going to have to send people down there to get him his horses. Now, what does the Torah not want? Shedava ze osra ha-Torah sheyetzorich le-Mitzrayim. Torah doesn't want us to need Egypt. Now, other things that are not unique to Egypt, let's say Egypt happens to have a good produce that year. Okay, good. And one year Egypt, the other year Syria, the other year Lebanon, the other year Chad. I don't know, you'll go, you'll find food. You don't need that specific thing, but horses in a king's army, he needs them, and he needs Egypt. So now he says, Klal Adova, just like living b'kviyus, the Torah doesn't want. Why? These words. It looks like he is an Egyptian resident. He needs to live in Egypt, of the Egyptians. And therefore, a king who needs horses, he's going to need Egypt, and that's what the Torah doesn't want. Now, he doesn't like the Mizrahi shout, he doesn't like Ramban. Listen to what he says. So I think it's quite clear that the Maral is explaining to us why the Torah juxtapose the Isser of living in Mitzrayim with the Isser of with the not having horses. In other words, the Torah didn't just say this because it gave you an example. Torah is teaching up what's the Isser of living in Mitzrayim. To be tzorech in Mitzrayim. To create a value of Mitzrayim. To create a need that we need Mitzrayim. You can't need Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim has to be off our radar as far as needs. That's what the Torah doesn't want. Don't value Mitzrayim. Don't give Mitzrayim. Don't put Mitzrayim on a pedestal that you need them. That's why when the Rambam brings the Yisr, he writes l'shtakeya. L'shtakeya means to be shakua, aneingetan, to be involved. This is my life. This is my culture, my needs. And the only time we find these words in the Rambam and all of the Sefer Rambam from beginning to the end and all 14 parts of the Rambam is when it comes to Mitzrayim, in the Haggadah of Pesach and here. So if the Rambam it follows this trend of thought, then it's also to live today in Mitzrayim, of course. And the Rambam says it clearly. But who needed who there? He didn't need Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim needed him. No, I don't want to go with, you don't have to say he was forced, he was an onus. He went there because the king needed him. When you need him, he's not machshav Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is machshav him. And therefore the Rambam didn't hold that it was us because he knew he's not there for himself. He had no purpose in being there. He wasn't a tzorech l'Mitzrayim. So theoretically, if a person lives in Mitzrayim and it's clear that his being there is not for any personal gain, he's not tzorech l'Mitzrayim, but it's Mitzrayim tzorech loy, it would be mutter. Now that's a unique type of situation. The Rambam doesn't want others to follow that, because only he can make that decision, and he knew that that's the reason. And therefore, the Rambam says, I signs his name that he was over 3 Yisurim that tell you don't do it. I did it. My story is my story, but I'm telling you that my act of living here is an act of being over. Happens to be that I wasn't over. But that's what he's teaching everybody. Now, there's no doubt that's why he wrote it, to teach. But he was able to write it because he wasn't over. This could answer because it's not a steer to the Isser. The Rambam writes it's also finished. And he can't write this heter. Because this heter is a unique type of heter that's shaykh to a unique type of person. And it's almost impossible for a person to know that if he's not the Rambam. Again, it's only the Rambam who can make that decision and say that I don't need Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim needs me. And who else is on that level that Mitzrayim should need them? And therefore, his being there doesn't express a need of Mitzrayim. And that's why it could be mutter. So therefore, getting back to the Sikha, the focus of the Rebbe Sikha is not on the Rambam. Living in Mitzrayim, there's enough answers for that. I don't know if it means the answer that I'm giving you, but there are answers. Some are better for the Rambam's Shitta, some are not so good fitting in the Rambam Shitta, but there's enough. The focus of the Sikha therefore focuses on the Isser of marrying an Egyptian, and to that the Rebbe gives this meirik chiddush and beautiful chiddush. Anyway, Hatzlacha Rabba, and we should end, and the Mitzrayim should become a part of the Hasidah Eretz Yisrael Shetispasha B'chol Olam Kulei, with the coming of Mashiach speedily and in our